So, we're going to actually start reading from this, Road to Serfdom. Hayek is, just a little introduction, Nobel Prize winning, well, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. So this was written, or published rather, in 1944. And that's all I'll say for now, but I'll probably add in more info later. Chapter 1, The Abandoned Road. I'm skipping basically 60 pages of prefaces, forewords, and introductions. Mainly just introduction, I guess. But anyway, and forward. Yeah, so that's how I like to start. Just dive right in. Later, when I have time, look through the introductions. Why not just start from the real beginning? And I will be skipping stuff, so it's not a full reading. If you want a full reading, I suggest an audiobook or something, or get the text. But chapter 1, The Abandoned Road, he talks about, basically, so this was 1944, we were still at war when this was written. And he talks about sort of, it's not like fascism and Nazism just started from nothing, right? There were ideological shifts in society that occurred in the decades leading up to that. And, well, he has a lot of interesting stuff to say about it, so let's just get started. When the course of civilization takes an unexpected turn, when instead of the continuous progress which we have come to expect, we find ourselves threatened by evils associated by us with past ages of barbarism, we naturally blame anything but ourselves. Have we not all striven according to our best lights, and have not many of our finest minds incessantly worked to make this a better world? Have not all our efforts and hopes been directed toward greater freedom, justice, and prosperity? If the outcome is so different from our aims, if, instead of freedom and prosperity, bondage and misery stare us in the face, is it not clear that sinister forces must have foiled our intentions, that we are the victims of some evil power which must be conquered before we can resume the road to better things? However much we may differ when we name the culprit, whether it is the wicked capitalist or the vicious spirit of a particular nation, the stupidity of our elders, or a social system not yet, although we have struggled against it for half a century, fully overthrown. Or a social system not yet, although we have struggled against it for half a century, fully overthrown. We all are, or at least were until recently, certain of one thing, that the leading ideas which during the last generation have become common to most people of goodwill and have determined the major changes in our social life cannot have been wrong. We are ready to accept almost any explanation of the present crisis of our civilization except one, that the present state of the world may be the result of genuine error on our own part, and that the pursuit of some of our most cherished ideals has apparently produced results utterly different from those which we expected. While all our energies are directed to bring this war to a victorious conclusion, it is sometimes difficult to remember that even before the war, the values for which we are now fighting were threatened here and destroyed elsewhere. Though for the time being, the different ideals are represented by hostile nations fighting for their existence, we must not forget that this conflict has grown out of a struggle of ideas within what, not so long ago, was a common European civilization, and that the tendencies which have culminated in the creation of the totalitarian systems were not confined to the countries which have succumbed to them. Though the first task must now be to win the war, to win it will only gain us another opportunity to face the basic problems and to find a way of averting the fate which has overtaken kindred civilizations. So what he's saying is that the fascism of the Italians and, well, let's say the totalitarianism of the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese is a manifestation of a greater problem. Or throw in the Bolsheviks or Stalin. into that as well. That it's a manifestation of a movement, some kind of ideological movement, changes in society, changes in how people think. It is not, it's easier to think of these as just isolated enemies, that we can just say, these are evil enemies, we must destroy them, without looking at sort of the shifts in human thinking that occurred leading up to that, and realizing that those shifts in human thinking are not isolated just to those enemies, but they are throughout Western civilization. Continuing. Now, it is somewhat difficult to think of Germany and Italy, or of Russia, not as different worlds, but as products of a development of thought in which we have shared. It is at least so far as our enemies are concerned, easier and more comforting to think that they are entirely different from us, and that what happened there cannot happen here. Yet the history of these countries in the years before the rise of the totalitarian system showed few features with which we are not familiar. The eternal conflict is a result of a transformation of European thought, in which others have moved so much faster as to bring them into irreconcilable conflict with our ideals, but which has not left us unaffected. That a change of ideas and the force of human will have made the world what it is now, though men did not foresee the results, and that no spontaneous change in the facts obliged us thus to adapt our thought, is perhaps particularly difficult for the Anglo-Saxon nations to see, just because in this development they have, fortunately for them, lagged behind most of the European peoples. We still think of the ideals which guide us, and have guided us for the past generation, as ideals only to be realized in the future, and are not aware how far in the last 25 years they have already transformed, not only the world, but also our own countries. We still believe that, until quite recently, we were governed by what are vaguely called 19th century ideas, or the principle of laissez-faire. Compared with some other countries, and from the point of view of those impatient to speed up the change, there may be some justification for such belief. But although until 1931 England and America had followed only slowly on the path on which others had led, even by then they had moved so far that only those whose memory goes back to the years before the last war know what a liberal world has been like. So I want to add some comments that just popped into my head. Well, one of the things I believe is that it's been said by many, many others, but the most important right, human right, is the right to free speech. Because once you lose that right, others can make you do things you don't want to do. That's kind of, I wish I could elaborate on that more, but try to visualize that. When you don't have freedom of speech, you cannot speak out publicly about things. How society might force you to do things that you don't want to do, and you cannot sufficiently fight against it because you're not allowed to speak out in certain ways. And I think that once you lose, once you lose the freedom of speech, I think that all bets are off as far as the future of your society. It's not going to be surprising that you see a movement more and more in some radical direction where, first off, I think you need some degree of radical people in power before you reach that point of not having freedom of speech. And once you reach that point, those radicals within that radical movement will fight each other for power, and the more radical, the more violent, the more insane will often go to the top. I don't have the confidence to say 100%, but I do believe that this effect happened a lot in the first half of the Soviet Union, starting with when Lenin took over. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Lenin, when the initial revolution happened, in Russia, Lenin was kicked out of the country. So there was infighting among Marxists and socialists, and Lenin came back and sort of did another coup, to take control, and so that's an example of this infighting, an increase where one radical beat a set of other radicals. And then Stalin, when he took power, I think is another example of that. It was surprising to many that Stalin took power. It was thought that Trotsky would take over, but Trotsky, after Stalin took power, Trotsky was exiled and then later assassinated in Mexico. And it's said, I'm not sure if it's true, I've read it, that it's said that Lenin said Stalin must not come to power, that Stalin was, sometimes he's characterized as sort of a mafioso kind of character from his early days, that he was doing ordinary criminal stuff before he met Lenin. I don't know how true that is, true or not true it is, but I think we can probably all agree that Stalin was a pretty nasty human being, that it went progressively worse and worse from Lenin taking over and then Stalin taking over. And it's a comedy, all right, but if you watch The Death of Stalin, after Stalin died, you had this power struggle, and there's this one guy, I forget his name, one of the guys who was vying for power after Stalin's death was characterized as a very, very nasty, evil person. But I tried to read about that a bit, and some think that it was Khrushchev's propaganda labeled him as a pedophile and that kind of stuff. But so I don't know. I don't know what's true or not. But you often have this case, this situation where the more violent and evil person is going to rise to the top. And yeah, I think once freedom of speech is gone, you're in big trouble. Another place where this happened was in Japan. I think it was already in the 1920s when what actually happened is Japan had a secret police that was assassinating journalists, and freedom of speech was gone. If you spoke out, you would disappear. There's an example of a woman who wrote a letter to her husband. Her husband was, I believe, in Manchuria, somewhere in China. And she wrote a letter to him saying that she was uncomfortable with how things were going, and that freedom of speech was disappearing. She felt afraid to speak out, and she disappeared like a couple weeks later for that. Well, anyway, so yeah, it happened in Japan as well. You just don't hear about it as much. So let's see, should I leave it at that? So he's mentioning here some stuff he hasn't talked about. This is the first chapter. But later on, he goes on to say how that these sort of anti-liberal movements, England and America lagged behind. In fact, they may have been important for, well, certainly America was important for the beginning of liberalism. Then in France, well, you had the French Revolution, but then you had Napoleon taking over soon after. So mixed. In France, it was mixed, but and so there's a lot I don't know about it. But Adam Smith, we'll get in. He'll mention this later, but Adam Smith was also important. Adam Smith published Wealth of Nations in 1976, same year as the Declaration of Independence, and he was a Scotsman, and so he was very influential in sort of economic liberalization. And there's some other thinkers that will be mentioned later. So I think that America and England were important for the liberal movement. This is classical liberalism, as in liberty, freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom. And then this anti-liberalism, in various ways, grew in. He'll go on to say how Germany was sort of a center for this in the years leading up to the war, and that England and America lagged behind on this. So a lot of these ideas were there in England and America, but they lagged behind. So let me reread part of this, because I think now it might make more sense to some people. We still believe that until recently we were governed by what are vaguely called 19th century ideas, or the principle of laissez-faire. Compared with some other countries, and from the point of view of those impatient to speed up the change, there may be some justification for such belief. But although until 1931 England and America had followed only slowly on the path on which others had led, even by then they had moved so far that only those whose memory goes back to the years before the last war know what a liberal world has been like. The last war, I believe he's talking about World War I. And when you think 1931, I mean, you had FDR's New Deal. I don't remember exactly the year, but of course, so there's debate on what caused the Great Depression and what caused it to go on for basically a decade, roughly a decade in America. And so there are different sides to the debate there, but although I'm not an economist, I agree with the side of, say, Milton Friedman and others that that a lot of FDR's policies helped to prolong this situation. And even Hoover was a Republican, but for whatever reason he believed in these big sort of they were Keynesian ideas, but I think this was before Keynes was important. But these big public spending, big public works ideas. The Hoover Dam, some people look at these things and say, well, that's what brought us out of the Depression. Things like the Hoover Dam, big public spending, that brought us out of the Depression. Others will point at that and say, that is what caused the Great Depression to go on for so long, that delayed the recovery. So that is kind of the tip of an iceberg on a whole other discussion. I'm not sure how much he gets into that into this book, but I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Sorry, this video is far from perfect, but I'm trying to gradually improve what I'm doing. And like I said, this is kind of something I can look back on. Anyway, thank you and peace out.